and the only rules of the game are what you can do to him and what you can stop him from doing to you.
Stop, I need more stuff. Can't you see I need more stuff? But now we go.
Big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters. If you want to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. In return, you'll get ad-free content and a bonus episode every single week. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, I've just been sneaking Sensei's Divining Top into my deck. Dude,
that's the trick, right?
Isn't it great that there has now been everybody is calling for a Sowing Magma Spawn ban just because the card is egregious and terrible to play with and against. But also, I don't know, man. We're getting some traction for a Sensei's Top on ban. I'm just saying, it's not me.
Yeah,
it's
right.
everything else.
Yeah,
right. There's all these people over here. Hey, everybody over there. All these people over here, they keep talking to me about how they want Sensei's Divining Top on ban. I haven't even talked to this guy over here.
I think that we will see an Orcus Bowmasters ban before we see a Sensei's Divining Top unban.
Wow.
Just to get people into the comments immediately.
just bringing the whole energy down immediately, Zach.
Yeah.
Come on.
But so you obviously, everyone who's been paying attention over the last month or two has noticed that you've been really innovating with the Miracles deck that you have. And you almost don't even want to call it Miracles now. You want to call it Mystic Sanctuary deck. The legacy power level thing to do. And this is something I was talking with Eric, who we'll have on the show on Thursday. So this is Tuesday. On Thursday, you'll see me and Eric break down, really go into the weeds about Doomsday and its place in the meta right now. But something I was explaining to Eric is for your deck, it's a Miracles deck, and it used to be that Terminus and Treat the Angels were the legacy power level thing to do. But now it seems like the legacy power level thing to do is really recur your deck with just value out your opponent by fetching Mystic Sanctuary and then thwarting to continue to accrue value. And cards like Lorien Revealed are helping out with that plan. So I don't know. Give people a breakdown of sort of where you've been for the last couple of months, because I think it's been a minute since we really broke down the deck and gave people an idea what was going on. And of course, links below. Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield.com. Moxfield is the best deck building website on the internet. You can find all of my and Phil's decks in links below, including decks from this episode. And if you do, you'll be directly supporting the channel.
Yeah. So I've been iterating on the list because I agree Mystic Sanctuary is, in my mind, the most powerful thing to happen for Control since Sensei's Divining Top's ban. I think that despite a bunch of other tools that have been printed in since, whether that's the War of the Spark Planeswalkers or Fourth Aerolingus or any of the big sort of tap out haymaker style stuff, those tools I think are typically better suited in other archetypes for the most part. I think they're not as strong unless you're exactly and only Fenris Cloud. So if you're playing Teferi, I think you're better suited in the breakfast decks where you're just trying to be a City of Solitude that can remove a hateful permanent and then go off. I think that if you're playing Narset, you're just better off being in some sort of wheel type shenanigans deck, in which case you're more of a mid-rangey prison combo deck than you are a control deck. I think that's the static abilities on those two walkers are really more where the power level lies. And then similarly with Fourth Aerolingus, it's yes, it's a big fireball and 4-color control. But really, I think it was better suited in red-white initiative as both a red and white card for Chrome Mox that also is just a way to fast turn one a Monarch. And then the other card that you could argue is Up the Beanstalk, but we found is that Up the Beanstalk, at least in my opinion, has found that it's a better positioned card in a Day's Wasteland shell. So the Sultai Beanstalk decks are just better than the 4-color control-esque style Beanstalk decks because those decks just can never beat a Wasteland or a Current Wasteland package, and that's what the Sultai Beanstalk deck has. It's lower to the ground. It just doesn't need any of the bigger tools that otherwise the 4-color Beanstalk decks would have. And Leyline Binding isn't necessarily a requisite in a format where you can just play Days in Wasteland to stifle your opponent from ever getting to those bigger spells that Fatal Push or what's the green-black sorcery that I always forget?
Witherbloom Command. Yes.
Witherbloom Command otherwise wouldn't be able to hit. So Mystic Sanctuary, and then my most recent addition to the deck after going through a bunch of iterations, we can link to how we talked about what control would look like in a format that just in what would control look like if we had just abided by the constraints of the format, which in my POV was nothing really in your curve that you reliably need to get to above 2 CMC. I think that Ancient Tomb coming down too fast and Days in Wasteland just make it so that the format is compressed in such a way that with all the power level threats that are available, needing answers immediately, you just can't afford to have dead cards in your hand. And every land and threat at 3 or above mana that you don't deploy or develop before it's too late is just effectively a mulligan. And so how can we minimize that down to actually be able to operate low? Now, I've talked to some people who think that there is a conflict between that statement of not wanting your curve to be higher than 2 and Mystic Sanctuary not being on until earliest turn 4 being conflicting things. And I think that this is where, in my mind, they don't conflict, because if your deck is operating by being able to just not die, then Mystic Sanctuary is effectively your end game. And that end game happens with you not having to actually tap out. It does require that you develop past certain things, but this is why the episode that I wanted to talk about today, when you were like, let's talk about control a little bit further. There are two aspects of control that I've been two aspects that I've been influencing into my control shell from aspects that I've seen in other decks. The first is something that I've seen in like green-white depth style decks, and I know we're going to think, how could it be that green-white depths is inspiring a version of blue-white control? But I'll talk about why in terms of its theory crafting and where I'm applying it to mine. And then also how the backbone of control, I feel like, is as good or bad as Prismatic Ending is. So I feel like we have all of these cards that are good in blue-white control. You know, your cantrip suite, Mystic Sanctuary in my mind, which is the most powerful tool available to you. And the white cards like Source to Plowshares. Source to Plowshares in my mind is the best it has ever been, and is only going to get better as every creature that gets power crept from here until forever needs to be answered immediately. Source to Plowshares is just the best version of what it does, and will be the best version of what it does. I can't imagine they power creep it other than, you know,
until they power creep it. Yeah.
Instead,
MH4,
right?
MH4, baby.
MH4. If they print Source to Plowshares where you gain the life, it's like that's great, and still maybe below the curve. But
yeah,
it would be nice to have a little bit of more incidental life gain in that regard. You know, don't play your big creatures, play small creatures instead. Orcus Bowmasters still gets around it. So the difference though is because of all of the other pieces that you need to be able to interact with, Source to Plowshares alone isn't enough density of that effect. You need a higher amount. And in Miracle's decks of old, you would play 4 Terminus along with your 4 Source to Plowshares.
of course.
The thing is that Terminus, as we've talked about, almost an episode where I've, you know, been on the cusp of nearly cutting it all together, is that Terminus has not aged well with the power creep. Source to Plowshares has, because it has remained static and its necessity has increased. Because 1 mana to remove anything, even it will never trade down. Even if it trades down on, like if they recoup a card, the fact that it will never trade down on mana, and if an instant you can fire it off whenever you need to, that's really, really valuable. Whereas Terminus is not always going to stay at card parity. You might be down a card, even if it sweeps the board, and it requires setup, and it means that you have to otherwise put a bunch of other tools and infrastructure in your deck in order to like optimize the timing, in which case it might still not be optimized, and it's going to rot dead in your hand sometimes if you don't have an enabler to put it back on top of your deck. So like there's a bunch of things where like you were previously rewarded for putting in all that infrastructure, where now you just aren't. So I still play 1 Terminus in my deck because Mystic Sanctuary is so powerful, and I play a build which will where we'll talk about the theory behind it, where once you introduce 1 card into your deck, you theoretically have infinite copies of them because of Mystic Sanctuary. So those are the 2 things that I don't know if we talked about, where for control, at least this version of control, and when you hear me talk about this is just because of the puzzle that I solve, but like if you can apply this to the archetype that you are working on or the type of deck list that you're trying to tune, see if you can like sort of substitute in the pieces for your deck or your macro type versus what I'm talking about here with.
And this is all basically it's all off of the ABC deck building theory.
It's all off of ABC deck building. Yeah. So there's 2 different ways to look at the ABC deck building of my current build, which is the white cards, Source to Plowshares and Prismatic Ending, are the powerful legacy power level thing to do. Therefore, we want Mystic Sanctuary. Therefore, we want Thwart, which begets a bunch of other things. I think that's a little soft, though, because those are reactive pieces. I think the legacy power level thing to do in my shell, to argue, would be, I want Mystic Sanctuary because that gives me infinite copies of everything. Therefore, I want Thwart. Therefore, I want Merchant Scroll. And Merchant Scroll is the big addition that I've added. And that addition came because of when I was playing against a green-white depths player. And I know that we have talked about sort of backhandedly about how green-white depths is a good deck. It's a solid combo deck. It's a good mid-range deck when it needs to be. But we've sort of backhanded the idea that it's like 16 tutors, right? Elvish Reclaimer is Magus of the crop rotation. Knight of the Reliquary is Magus of the crop rotation. It plays 4 crop rotation. So it's just like mono tutors deck. It's playing Green Sun Zenith, 4 crop rotations. So like it's all of the literally everything that's not a land or a combo piece.
The consistency of that deck is at its all-time highest, right? Like there's not as much variance to that deck because of that.
Right. Like think if you were to break it down as to like, okay, what comprises this deck? It's mana sources, combo pieces, protection, and tutors. And then half of those tutors just happen to be able to attack, right? But like at the end of the day, it's just tutors. It's a deck of mono tutors. And I was like, if in this world where cantripping is costing time, and if we may be in a position where we otherwise don't have time, whether that's through development or because of the need to answer everything immediately, it means that we have to have a higher density of just having it, of just having the answer. And that's where the idea of Source to Plowshares and Prismatic Ending in a high enough density, because if you go up against Delver, it's like, okay, well, they're going to be on 4 Delver, 4 DRC, and if you get chunked for any meaningful thing into a range where a single shot from a Murktide Regions is going to kill you, you just have to have a higher density. You're not going to have time to cantrip into an answer because a Daze is going to clip it, right?
Yeah.
And you can't just walk into those positions, especially when you're on the draw. Same thing if you're playing against an Ancient Tomb opponent and they just put Chalice on 0, you're not going to have, or I'm sorry, Chalice on 1 on the draw, you're not going to be able to cantrip for your answers. You're just going to need to have it. And then same thing if you're on the play and you need to cantrip, you have to hope that to find the correct kind of answer for whatever they're going to deploy. And again, you may be off. So like just having a higher density of the thing, you just need to have the thing. You can't spend time cantripping for it where you might miss, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, well, I have played Vintage before, and every time I've ever played Vintage, what I have found is the tutors in Vintage, Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, Mystical Tutor, all of the tutors,
Merchant Scroll.
Sort of just give you what Merchant Scroll, that just give you what you need when you need it to answer whatever it is that's going on in a deck full of singletons.
Mm-hmm.
They're playing tutors for a bunch of their singletons, but like if they can find their singleton of a particular thing when they need it, it's always very good in control to just have whatever you need when you need it. And so when I was like, man, okay, well, I mean, Mystic Sanctuary is essentially a tutor in that it's a regrow, right? I'm tutoring something out of my graveyard on top of my deck. I was like, I really would, and I've tried Merchant Scroll before, way back when I was playing for it. I had the idea before, but there wasn't really anything to tie it together. But the green-white depths inspiration of this is the deck of mono tutors. And I was like, how close could I be to being a mono tutors deck, to be a control deck that always has whatever I need when I need it? And so the idea of Merchant Scroll, well, if I play 4 Merchant Scroll and then I have Mystic Sanctuary, I can theoretically just be continuously dipping back into my deck for whatever I want whenever I need it.
Well, Phil, I have a question about the Merchant Scroll, right? Because it's specifically blue, right? So how does that play out?
Blue instance.
Blue instance, yeah. So specifically blue instance. So you need Swords to Plowshares. How does that play out?
So when I was thinking of the actual inspiration for Merchant Scroll, which I had tried before, and originally when I tried it, it was off of the inspiration of Green-White Depths, which is why I bring it up, because like that, again, is another deck building theory that I've seen other decks find success with, and so I'm just trying to apply that to control. The same way of like previous, where we're trying to like just abide by the constraints of the format. What if we abided by those constraints and applied it to control? So just taking all these different avenues of other successful decks and applying them to a control shell and seeing what that would look like. That was the original impetus way back when I tested Merchant Scroll for the first time around. I didn't stick to it, but there are old games on 90s MTG where you can see me casting it.
Yeah.
This time around, I was looking for answers to, believe it or not, Orcus Bowmaster. And I was like, because again, the problem that Orcus Bowmaster that Control has is Control would use its cantrips to find answers, right? It's always been that like you can sandbag your cantrips, your opponent deploys whatever threat they're going to deploy, and then you can cantrip trying to find the answer if you're not looking for counter magic.
Yeah.
So you can search for the right kind of removal when you need it, because the whole point of the cantrip cartel being powerful is it is the glue so you draw the right half of your deck and you draw the cards that you need when you need them. So for timing and lining up the correct spells, the problem is Orcus Bowmasters sort of upends that whole notion because you can't cantrip into the Orcus Bowmasters. So you could just be sitting with a bunch of cantrips, not being able to cast them, because if you do, you die before you'd be able to deploy whatever the removal spell would be. Because if you remove the Orcus Bowmasters, well, there's still the big chunker on the table that it left behind that's going to kill you. So if it was all in one package, like if the Bowmaster just built itself up and then it could be removed, then maybe you could cantrip and just trade some life. But the fact that you have to get rid of this otherwise, prison piece on the table in this Orcus Bowmasters, but it leaves behind this big Tarmogoyf, it's like, okay, well, there's no tool that exists that can deal with both in a way that's clean and playable. So it's like, I need an answer to Orcus Bowmasters that's not just Swords to Plowshares or Prismatic Ending, because Prismatic Ending is too slow. You're still going to get chunked for some amount of damage, and like there's going to be other tools that Orcus Bowmaster decks typically are going to require you to deploy that on first. Whether it's Griskus Control, where you have to spend your removal on the DRC because you can't let that stay. Again, it's like all of this infrastructure around where, because every threat needs answering, you can't just leave any threat on the table hoping to line your removal up somewhere else. You die too fast. So you just need a higher density to match the higher density of power that is in the format. And so what I went to was looking deep in my Scryfall search. I found Piracy Charm. Piracy Charm is a blue instant that is the time spiral shift of Funeral Charm.
Funeral Charm, yes. Funeral Charm, a classic. During your draw step, you have one card in hand. I will Funeral Charm you. Hey, Legacy fans, since you're enjoying the show, please like and subscribe the video. It helps the channel grow.
Support Eternal Turtles on Patreon so we can create even more content and cover events.
Patreons get an ad-free RSS feed, 4 bonus episodes a month, and Discord recognition. Join the Dirtle Maniacs at patreon.com/EternalDirtles.
Now back to the show. Yeah, so it is Funeral Charm. The text on it is target player discards card. Target creature gets +2/-1 until end of turn. And I don't even know the third mode.
Island Walk. It gives a creature Island Walk. Funeral Charm with Swamp Walk.
So relevant, Zach. So relevant. The
Island Walk is big, man. Sometimes you need to get through. You're gonna get through with a lot of creatures with Island Walk.
Your creatureless control deck needs to get through. Yeah. So I was looking. So I saw Piracy Charm, and I was like, oh, okay. Well, it's really. That's an interesting thing because being able to get rid of an Orcus Bowmaster at instant speed with an island is really good. Like blue mana, get rid of your Orcus Bowmaster. That's really valuable in a deck that is pretty much in only islands.
For sure.
And so, but I was like, but I'm not going to play for Piracy Charm, even if the fail safe on the floor on it is it's a Raven's Crown. That's not good enough. So I was like, okay, well, I'm interested in that. And so that pulled me back into the Merchant Scroll tech. And then Merchant Scroll just sort of led me down a whole nother lane of like, okay, well, are there blue instants that can solve other problems in the format?
Sure.
So I really came to Merchant Scroll because I was looking for answers to Orcus Bowmaster. And this is where, like, having done so many years of iteration on one list, I came back to an old tech that I like sort of had ruled out before, which was this Merchant Scroll package that was influenced by Green-White Depths technology. And then came to, okay, well, I have a problem now that I would like to solve. And Merchant Scroll just happens to be a way to tie that room together. And so there are a bunch of games now where you can watch this sort of thing play out on 90s MTG, where this this Piracy Charm comes into play. But the reason that I dedicated time to trying to iterate this particular thing beyond Bowmaster was I was like, oh, Piracy Charm isn't just Bowmaster or Raven's Crime, Bowmaster removal or Raven's Crime. It also deals with Nomad's Encore, which is really powerful and a top deck in the format in multiple iterations. It can also deal with an unflipped DRC, Delirium DRC. It can also deal with an unflipped Delver. I was like, this thing has a lot of text while also just being pitchable in blue and also tutorable off your Merchant Scroll. So it's like, between all this, to deal with my opponent's Bowmasters, it's like, okay, well, if I have 4 Swords to Plowshares, 4 Merchant Scrolls, and a Piracy Charm, I now have 9 ways to remove this Bowmaster without having to cantrip. You tack on Prismatic Endings, and that's 13. Okay, so now I have 13 answers to your 4 Bowmasters, and as long as I keep my life total high enough that I can take that initial hit if I have to go at sorcery speed to remove it, then this should theoretically just outsize index myself to never having to be in this spot. So all that is to say is you can be rewarded for having, iterated on your list over time and remembered why. Like, the thing is more than just testing things to test them in the dark, like in the blind. Be like, oh, let's see how this goes. Like, actually having theory and rationale behind why you're making certain choices to cards or structure just means that, like, oh, I knew why I had Merchant Scroll before, which was I really wanted to optimize the thwart package with Mystic Sanctuaries when I was really, really teching that out as hard as I could. And what is nice about that package with all of these tools that are relevant in the format, even if you naturally draw the bullets, it's like, okay, yeah, Green Sun Zenith has all of these bullets that it's like sometimes you don't want the Collector Oath, but like when you do, it's awesome.
Yeah.
I don't always want the Piracy Charm, but when I do, it's awesome. So like that thing to me is like, if you look at Merchant Scroll in my control shell as the Green Sun Zenith of all the Green Sun Zenith shells, it doesn't look as crazy or wild of a take as it does. Like we're so used to seeing Green Sun Zenith with a bunch of different bullets. Like the idea that can control that could do theoretically the same thing is also powerful, presuming that the tools are there and are relevant to the format. Green Sun Zenith wouldn't have those bullets if it didn't. Like, not everybody plays Gaddock Teague all the time, but when they do, you're like, oh, that's a metagame call, and that's easy to do because they're in that Green Sun Zenith shell. Right now, like I have a bunch of weird things that I'm trying out.
I was about to say you've got a card that I have not seen since I played it in limited.
Yeah, so Depose Deploy is my win condition of choice in this deck. Now, this goes back to being an impassioned and diehard control mage that I am. The win condition for control should be nothing. There isn't a win. The win condition is not dying.
Yeah.
And between the what I play, which is Witness the Future, which I'm hoping they just print a better version of. Witness the Future is essentially just the blue guy's blessing, except that doesn't have the relevant text of when it's milled, you flip your graveyard back into your library. But it is the closest thing to Guy's Blessing blue has ever had to being playable.
Yeah.
And I hope that in the future they just give us a better, more playable version than that, because Witness the Future is not good. It's just solving a very specific role within the deck, which is it is able to recur everything that Mystic Sanctuary can't. If you watch our previous episode where we talked about Argivian Find and Conjurer's Bauble being able to essentially recur everything that Mystic Sanctuary can't and being the middle linchpin between all of those things, it's like, okay, I have to open up a slot to artifacts and enchantments. That's Argivian Find. I need a slot that can recur lands. That's Conjurer's Bauble. All of them together mean that everything I can recur everything and I have access to everything forever, always. And if you just replace those two cards with Witness the Future can recur anything. Mystic Sanctuary can recur the Witness the Future, so I have access to everything always. I've leaned more on Argivian Find when I was trying other things like Shark Typhoon and Ominous Seas and different types of tech, and it just led me in that direction. But now that I'm on the Merchant Scroll tech, I'm like, okay, well, I want the capacity for Merchant Scroll. Unfortunately, Witness the Future isn't an instant, but there isn't any playable blue instance in that space. That is just these cards don't exist yet in a playable fashion for the format. When they do, it will just make the shell a lot better. I imagine that is similar to Green Sun Zenith mages that are like, oh, if only we had a playable green creature that did blank. And they're like, oh, we would really love this blank effect that just doesn't exist on a green creature yet. That would be lovely. When it does, I'm sure that it will just show up. It's sort of like, Keen-Eyed Curator. I mean, I get that that's just a scavenging ooze, but it's like if they didn't have access to that effect and then suddenly they got it, they'd be like, oh, hell yeah, this is going in. This is one of easy, slam dunk forever. So like when they print something like that, which could be literally any time from now until any time ever, that'll be a great replacement. But for Depose Deploy, there are two aspects that the deck needs that you want to be Merchant Scrollable, because the whole deck is now built around this Mystic Sanctuary Merchant Scroll combination. Before I touch on that, Witness the Future also being very cool, because if you have Merchant Scrolls, which obviously you have, I'm playing all four, but if you cycle anything back in with Witness the Future, you can then Merchant Scroll for it, which is really nice. So you can actually, just tutor it back out of the deck. So build your own demonic tutor. But with Depose Deploy, it's solving two problems. One is you need to, for a lot of players who are unwilling to scoop when they are just effectively hard locked, whether that's under a counterbalance or multiple counterspells, like especially when the counterspells are face up and they know about them and they just still won't concede. They just are like, well, how do you beat me? Not every player, like in a known community, like if they know what your deck is doing and they like understand the theory behind it, and like in my local scene where they all understand like how the deck operates and what it does, they're like, oh, I understand. You can never deck, like you've explained this to me, I'll scoop. But like in an open field at like a MagicCon or an Eternal Weekend where players are like, who are you? I have no idea who you are. I hate you. And what do you do? They're like, well, how do you win? And I go, it's like they go, how do you win? And I go, well, I don't win, you lose. Is like, I win because I eliminate the possibility of ever being able to lose, and then you lose because you can't, you just deck. And they're like, well, how don't you deck? And I explain the whole Thwart Mystic Sanctuary engine where you can never deck. But sometimes like you just need to show players a win condition. Like how do you actually kill them? And so Depose Deploy does two things. It solves that problem where I can show them the card that actually kills them now that they're effectively hard locked, like this just eventually gets there. And also it is main deckable life gain.
Which is solid for you.
I played Revitalize in some numbers before just as a way to have like playable life gain, like somewhere in the deck to have life gain. Because again, once you have any effect in your deck with a recursive Mystic Sanctuary engine, you have infinite copies of that effect. So like introducing literally even the smallest incremental effect into your deck means that you have access to it, which means that your behavior can act as such that, like, going long, I can afford to take this hit because I know eventually I'll be able to gain that life back and theoretically gain infinite life if the game were to go on forever. So, like, similarly, like, I still have the one terminus because I'm like, if for some reason somebody was able to turn off spot removal with whatever it may be, I have a way to sweep the board, and I can sweep the board forever, always, as many times as I want, theoretically, if the game went on forever. And so that's the reason for Depose Deploy. But then the only other real playable blue instant that is a win condition that you can play in the format, I think, is Intrude on the Mind, which is the worst version of Fact or Fiction. It's a 5 mana, it's 3 blue. It's you flip over the top 5 cards of your deck, you separate them into 2 piles, and then your opponent chooses to give you one of those piles. And then whatever pile they don't give you, you make a Thopter with +1/+1 counters equal to the number of cards that went to your graveyard. So, Zach, if I flipped over 5 cards, I split them 3 and 2. You gave me 2 cards, I would make a 3/3 Thopter. So, like, in that regard, it's like you have to just assume that whatever that flyer is, whatever that creature you make, is drawing an additional card. So, at the very least, you are always going to be guaranteed to go, okay, this is 5 mana for 3 cards at instant speed. That's always going to put some kind of beater on the table, whether that's a 2/2 or a 3/3. Or you could do other splits where you could be like, I'm going to split this and go 5-0. You can give me no cards, but then I get an instant speed 5/5 flyer, and, like, where do we go from here? Likewise, they could give you 5 cards if they're like, I really can't afford to have a beater on the table because that will end the game or whatever it may be. So, like, I've tested with that before. I've used the Gaia's Blessing package with that, similar to old Fact or Fiction pre-modern type style builds where you would Fact or Fiction and then you'd flip over Gaia's Blessing, and then Gaia's Blessing would flip everything back into your deck after you it went to the graveyard and whatnot. But the problem with that is that it's a 5 mana spell.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember the conversation that we just had moments ago.
You want everything to kind of operate off of 2 mana. You
got to be able to operate off of 2 mana. And Depose Deploy, deploy is which is the it's 2 white blue, and it at instant speed creates 2 1/1 flyers, and then you gain life equal to the number of creatures you control. I have only ever always had it make 2 1/1s and gain 2 life. I've never gained more than 2 life because there are other things to do beyond that little buffer. That is enough time. But the fact that it also has a 1 and an Azorius hybrid mode, which is tap target creature, draw a card. So at the very least, I can cycle it for 2 mana if there's a creature on the table. Now, that has not come up for me yet. Like, I have not needed to use that mode yet. But the fact that that mode is there means that it is not just a dead card in the opener.
Yeah.
If my opponent puts a Tameo on the table, and I'm like, well, I don't want to fire off this I don't want to fire off removal into a potentially open brainstorm. So instead of letting you get a clue, I'm just going to tap it down and draw a card. Same thing if you just needed to tap an early beater just to time walk that combat step, you tap it, draw a card. So, like, the fact that it can cycle in the early game, the downside though is it's not tap up to 1 target creature, it's tap target creature.
Yeah, there needs to be something on the board. Yeah,
there needs to be something on the board. But that is also in the space of, if you're playing control where white cards need to have text in order for your game ones to be relevant games, then you are already open to that to begin with. You, like, by taking Stork Plowshares into an event, you're presuming that your white cards have text against the majority of the field that you're going to face, and so that's just an acceptable thing. Would it be great if you could just cycle it and not need the creature there? Of course,
sure.
But, like, this was printed back in old Ravnica. Fire design hadn't happened yet. Maybe nowadays they would let you cycle it, so the rationale for it is it's a win condition that is not dead early, that is tutorable off Merchant Scroll. It's a combination of all those things. Is the card good? No, it's not good. But is it solve this very, very particular niche of tools that you need to solve within this particular scalpel of what we're looking for? Yeah. Well, and then the other card I've been testing out, which looks good on camera, it has looked good in gameplay, but there's a rationale for it that I could see it going away, and it has to do with a card that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily go to. I'm playing a 1 of Cryptic Command.
Yeah.
Now, that Cryptic Command is for Merchant Scroll and Counterbalance to tie the room together. I want Merchant Scroll to be able to have access to tutoring any CMC that I would otherwise need. Now, I'm playing 1 of Brain Surge as a 3-drop. That 3-drop could be an Archmage's Charm, which I've considered. Archmage's Charm being a 3-mana spell that can draw 2 cards, or be a counter spell similar to Cryptic Command. But it also has the relevant text of stealing a permanent of 1 CMC, non-land permanent, 1 CMC or less that your opponent controls. So, like, being able to steal an opposing Tameo that's been flipped already, pretty good. Being able to steal a threat, pretty good. Stealing your opponent's Grindstone, pretty good. Stealing a construct and then trading that way, pretty good. So, like, I have played that tech before. I have to test it a little bit more. Right now, I'm on Brain Surge just because it is the more, in my view, like the more raw power level card. Since Archmage's Charm, in particular, of like those stealing 1 CMC things, that's good, but there isn't a very specific 1 CMC thing that I care about in the format right now that isn't solved in another way. Whereas like when I was going to Merchant Scroll for Piracy Charm, I really specifically was like, Piracy Charm is for exactly specifically Bowmaster. It happens to have really good crossover into Nomads on Core and like the Delver Suite and like all that stuff. But really in my head, I'm like, this is in the deck because Bowmaster exists.
Yeah.
It just happens to have a bunch of crossover. So like until Archmage's Charm has a 1 CMC permanent or less that I like, I'm like, oh, I need this to steal that because there isn't otherwise a good answer to it. I think I'm sticking with the Brain Search unless something else comes along. But then for Cryptic Command, that's the 4 CMC spell that Merchant Scroll will be able to tutor that works with the thing. It is also the thing that can solve the problem of getting rid of anything on the board that Prismatic Ending can't.
Yeah.
So Prismatic Ending's limitations are, if I didn't have to splash the third color, I wouldn't. But you need to because Prismatic Ending going up to 3 is really important. Similarly, Prismatic Ending going up to 4 against bad matchups would also be really relevant because otherwise that card has no text. So if you go up against the Ancient Tomb, your Prismatic Ending is already going to be taxed because you need your third color. And then sometimes it's just going to be blank because you can't hit a fourth color. So having access to something that can solve the problems that Prismatic Ending can't is really valuable. Now, there are still room to grow. You're catching me at a time where I'm still teching a little.
Yeah, I was about to say, we have talked about sort of the evolution of this idea a bit further. It's something you sent to me last night, which is I think is a significant upgrade to this particular strategy.
Yeah, so there's two. The one that I sent you is actually an iteration of the first thing that I thought of. I want to just speak to the fact of like people who might be thinking about Sink into Stupor, which is a good card. It's 1 blue. It's MDFC. It's the blue land that can come in if you pay 3 life, but it also has return target spell or non-land permanent to its owner's hand for 1 blue. So that is an instant, and so it's a land that you can get off of Merchant Scroll, which is important if you need to hit your land drop. But it also theoretically solves the problems that Prismatic Ending can't. But the problem is there's a difference in that you can't hit lands, you can't bounce a land, and so it can't like time walk an opponent that like is using soul lands or something like that.
Okay.
It also like can't like solve an Urza Saga problem, right? Like if an Urza Saga's trigger goes on the stack or something in the mid to late game, you bounce it back and then it resets. But also it doesn't solve the problem forever. Because it just returns the thing back to their hand, usually at a downgrade. 3 mana is a lot for a bounce spell. Yeah. Whereas at least Cryptic Command doing that bounce, it's also replacing itself. So you're not going down the card to bounce it. It costs the additional mana, but like we're in the space of just trying to solve the additional thing on Prismatic Ending. Now the other space that I could go into instead of that is you could play a Waterlog Teaching, which is 3 and a Dimir hybrid. I believe Dimir hybrid. It might be 3 and a blue. Okay. I believe Dimir hybrid. And that is just another tutor. It's a 3 and a blue to search for an instant or a card with flash.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have a color restriction the way Merchant Scroll does, and it can also get creatures with flash. And that has the MDFC comes in as a blue-black tap land. So if you play your 3rd color splash, and then that is theoretically your 4th color splash that you can find off of your Merchant Scroll, then your Prismatic Endings theoretically in any game can get up to 4 mana.
Okay.
And so there's that space. That's where I was before the tech that I sent to you. The tech that I texted Zach is a card called Magma Opus.
Magma Opus.
Big boy Magma Opus.
Magma Opus is a 8 mana sorcery or instant?
It's an instant, bro.
8 mana instant that says deal 4 damage to any target, make a 4/4, tap 2 creatures?
So it's tap 2 permanents, and it's also deal 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of permanents. Oh my god.
And then draw 2 cards. But the relevant text here, because who's going to spend 8 mana, is pay 2 Is It hybrid mana and discard this and create a treasure token.
So this is the in that same space of the while this one doesn't gain life and it being 6 blue red, it is the card where
this is your win condition.
This can prove like in a world where in deploy and the Thopters on deploy not being like relevant, like the card is fine. It's whatever. It's not good. But like the fact that it can show that it's like, oh well, if you just aren't able to take any more game actions because you're locked out because I can counter every spell you take and draw a bunch of cards every turn or whatever, these 1/1s will just kill you.
Yeah.
Like I can show that they will kill you. And so it can solve that problem of just being like the how do you kill me problem. I can just show you this card. It shows damage and threats and can kill you. But what it does is in the early game, it just being able to go blue, discard this, make a treasure. It ramps you, right? So you can get into a position of like you can just get through development a little bit faster to buy enough time to get into the stage where your Mystic Sanctuaries
Sure.
are live in a way that is really powerful. But also, creating a treasure token means that, again, with what we just talked about, it can level up your Prismatic Endings. And it can level up your Prismatic Endings against the Ancient Doom decks in a way that's more
All
relevant.
the way to
because
5 if you need to.
all the way to 5 if you were to play the other tech, which
Sure.
that's going to be metagame dependent. But what it can do is it can get your Prismatic Endings up to 4 on turn 3.
Yeah.
So if your opponent puts a 4-drop into play on turn 2 off of 2 soul lands, pass to you on your turn 3 after you've cycled the Magnus, then you can Prismatic Ending their 4-drop, whether that's a ring or a Karn or whatever. That is just that particular line is not something you ever would have had access to before. There's just nothing else that does that unless you're playing some other weird thing. This one just happens to be also something that you can fetch off of your Merchant Scroll. So if we're in that position in the game where you're like, I know a 4-drop is the thing that I have to care about, and I have this Prismatic Ending, I need to find a cycler. So that is something that I also want to tech out for that idea as a reason. Again, that isn't like, oh, I just want it because it could be cool the way that Archmage's Charm could be cool. It's because it's solving a very specific problem, and that problem is the power, not the power level, like the capacity for what a Prismatic Ending can do.
Yeah.
And Prismatic Ending essentially being that role of where Terminus used to be a long time ago, of
swords 5 through 8,
it was solving all your problems that Swords to Plowshares can't. The thing is, back when Terminus was a good card, it's because it was against things like Leovold and Deathrite Shaman on the table, or a bunch of Baleful Strixes that you didn't want to trade your plows against, or TNN, which was a card that Swords to Plowshares couldn't even touch. So the metagame of when all of that was around, a bunch of Baleful Strixes, Leovold and Deathrite Shaman, TNN, all these things that otherwise Swords to Plowshares wasn't very good against. Terminus solved that problem, right? It was just everything that Swords to Plowshares can't do, Terminus can. This is great. And then that is sort of being filled by Prismatic Ending now, where it's anything that Swords to Plowshares can't handle, Prismatic Ending can. Prismatic Ending can solve getting rid of a Grindstone. Swords to Plowshares can't. You see where I'm going with.
Well, Phil, I think I don't even know if we mentioned this, but you're currently in your last 7 matches 7-0 with this plan.
So I'm 7-0 after I went 4-1-2 at MagicCon Vegas. I'm Vegas, Chicago, where I wasn't playing this version of the list. I wasn't playing Merchant Scroll in Chicago.
Yeah.
I was playing. That was when I was teching out Legacy Zalur.
We have both lists on the Eternal Dirtles Mox Field, so you can check those out below.
Yeah, Legacy Zalur was sort of like that first instance before I found Piracy Charm. As I want to put this on a table as a way to steal Bowmaster.
Seal of Bowmasters, as you
call
it.
Seal of Bowmaster, yeah. And that actually came up in my first round. We talked about that. I played against Demir Reanimator, and I just had Legacy Zalur on the table, and it's just sort of locked out their Bowmaster from being relevant because I cast a cantrip. They tried to fire their Bowmaster in response. I took out the Legacy Zalur, and then it locked them out of their cantrips. That was a fun moment. I was like, neither of us need to have this. We just get rid of this card. But anyway, but then when I found Piracy Charm, I was like, oh, this is just better because it's not just an additional thing for a problem. It is part of a package that I want anyway with everything else that I have going on. That then is informing a bunch of other choices of how I can solve other problems. That is, Bowmaster was my biggest problem, so I was like, I need to be able to solve that. And then it just so happens that now I'm looking for, okay, well, what could Merchant Scroll do that would help me solve the other problems that the deck has? Now, all that is to say, my last 7 matches, I have not run up against Ancient Tomb. I've beat everything from Delver to Breakfast to Nadu to Storm. I've run the gambit except Ancient Tomb. So
must be nice to have some sort of a gentleman's agreement at your local that everyone's off Eldrazi.
It's just because it might also just be that I'm dodging it because I also there was a bunch of Ancient Tomb in Chicago. Yeah. I think that there is just sort of the target on the Ancient Tomb shells.
Yeah. Well, specifically, I think Red Stompy on in paper, I think is pretty underrepresented. And I don't say that people should be playing it more, but I think that people have just moved away from Red Stompy, so you're not seeing as many Ancient Tombs in that regard. And then let's say you do see Show and Tell. I think you're fine against the Show and Tell deck, right?
Yeah, I would say that the more specifically, when I say the Ancient Tomb decks that I would otherwise struggle with, I specifically mean 4-drop Ancient Tomb decks, and that is also specifically because those things get out of Prismatic Ending range.
Exactly.
In my current build. If you're on mono 4-drop Ancient Tomb deck, it just blanks. It just means Prismatic Ending doesn't have text outside of removing your defense grid or whatever. and those games, we all know that those games just even if you remove the defense grid, they just slam a game-ending 4-drop every turn of the game until you're dead.
Yeah.
So like in that regard, like if it's an Ancient Tomb like Painter, I feel good against Painter. If it's Ancient Tomb combo, I feel good against combo. Because Prismatic Ending will have text in those matchups in ways where it doesn't if I'm running up against the One Ring Karn, Ancient Tomb deck, or big Eldrazi or like aggro Eldrazi that are playing a bunch of One Rings and Thought Knot Seers and shit and sowing Mycos Bombs, but like I don't necessarily think that those matchups are bad because they're bad for Tundra in general. They are, but like if we wanted to solve those problems, we as the control mage could just over-index for it if that's what the expected metagame was going to be. Again, as control, we have to react to what we expect that we're going to play against, and having a pretty strong matchup against Delver right now, just being on as a ship pile of white cards is pretty good. But like if we wanted to be able to solve that problem, we would have to over-index for it in a way that like changes the structure of the deck pretty meaningfully, without a tool that like we could just play that is good against them. And if Prismatic Ending could hit their 4-drops, then it's not impossible that like matchup would be a lot better. Now, suddenly Mycos Bombs is a whole other issue. That's double strip mine. That's different. That's a power outlier.
Yeah.
But like, could we beat Karn? Well, we could beat Karn if our Vindicate could touch it.
Sure.
When our Vindicate can't touch it, Karn is untouchable, and that means that Karn wins the game.
Specifically, your deck has a lot of problems with Karn because Karn into Lattice is a fine play, but against most decks, Karn into Lattice is just not enough unless they've cleared the board out or they have a ensnaring bridge or something like that to stop the attacking. Your deck specifically is very bad against Karn because there is no pressure until you decide to end the game. So they tick down Karn, get whatever they want. Normally Lattice, and if they can resolve the Lattice through your counterbalance, which seems pretty easy for them to do, then the game is over for you.
And that is also like to point out too, like that is also representative of particularly the War of the Spark Planeswalkers, where again, it's not the abilities of the card that are powerful; it's the static
ability. Yeah.
Now, like the static just being in tandem tied to the Lattice being a win condition, but it's the static that becomes the problem there. It's the same thing with Teferi and Narset, right? Like the removing of something and drawing a card, or like the fact that they also are draw engines on top of being the prison pieces. Yeah. It's the prison part of those cards that is the problem for control decks. Like my build of control, I have no problem if you're drawing cards. If we're both drawing cards and we're just in a high as fuck resource situation for the entirety of the game, I am designed to never run out of gas or die. Yeah. Like I played against Standstill on camera, and I just like openly
have some cards.
The Standstill immediately. I was like, draw your cards. Dude. You and I are both drawing a whole ton of cards, and it doesn't matter. I'm like, my deck is situated to never die. It has the model of going forever.
Come at me with your Mishra's factories. I'll gladly source the plowshares on forever.
Dude, have you ever heard of the Infinite Game?
The Infinite Game, as in like a Magic Infinite Game, or just like a thing called the Infinite Game?
The theory of an infinite game.
I mean, I'm vaguely aware of it, but go ahead, please.
So, I mean, this could be a whole other article topic, but like for my terms of control, there are two types of games. There's infinite games and finite games.
Sure.
A finite game is a game of Magic, right? It is defined by the players are known. It's you and me. We have a set of rules that we both agreed to. It is the rules of Magic the Gathering. And we know that there is a set endpoint to the game.
There's a terminal part of the game,
We know that if either of our life totals hit 0 or time and round, that is the end of the game.
The Infinite Game is you building miracles.
Infinite Game is the theory behind miracles of never being able to die. Now, but like there's a difference in the theory behind what a finite game is, which abides by the rules that I just said, and an infinite game, which only has 2 rules, and a lot of it doesn't apply to Magic because Magic itself is a finite game, right? Sure. There is a finite amount of time that you're playing a match.
Yes.
So it is inherently a finite game. But there is some cool theory within the idea of an infinite game, which applies by these rules, which are there are no rules. The players are ever changing. Players can come and go as they please. And there are only 2 things that matter. You have to have the will and the resources to play the game. And the only thing that you want to do with the will and resources to play the game is to perpetuate the game. So if at any point... So the easiest example ever, right? The easiest example is your job, right? Theoretically, your job is an infinite game. Let's say you want to do your job forever, right? Until you retire, whenever that may be. Maybe it doesn't. But like you have to have the will to play to do that job, and you have the resources to do that job. And the will and the resources to do that job the purpose of those things is to perpetuate the job. So you keep having the job, right? That's an infinite game.
Yeah.
Similar, like if you want to scope it out, life, my guy, is an infinite game.
Well,
you have to have the will to be alive, and you have to have the resources to be able to do the things you want to do when you're alive. And the whole point of both those things is to perpetuate staying alive. That's an infinite game. So now, while you can't go actual infinite forever in Magic, the idea behind I just want to have the will to play this game and the resources to keep playing it to perpetuate it forever do work in a control shell, theoretically, if you could go forever. And I love that idea. It's so poetic to me.
Yeah. So I wanted to, this is a bit of an aside, but there's a great Orson Scott Card quote, Ender's Game, that kind of goes over parts of this, and it talks about there are only, there are only two rules to the game, basically. Like, no one but the enemy will ever teach you how to destroy or conquer, and only the enemy shows you where you are weak. And then enemy tells you where he is strong, and the only rules of the game are what you can do to him and what you can stop him from doing to you. Which is like, it's the only two rules of the game: what you can do to stop from dying, and what you can do to kill the other guy. Right? Like that. Not necessarily the infinite game, but it does hedge on those things. A great book by a real asshole.
And I just want to, I guess our closing thoughts on this idea for now is there is something to be said about having that sort of theory when you're playing, and not necessarily like going beyond card choices. It informs how you get to play, right? And it informs a certain amount of choices. Like when I sit down at the table, I know I'm in the control role because I've chosen the farthest side of the control spectrum, which is to go forever. So like I can always assume that role, and that informs me to be able to make a bunch of choices that I otherwise may not be able to make. If we're thinking who's the beatdown, it's pretty clear to know who the beatdown is when you're playing the farthest end of the spectrum. The other aspect of being able to go forever, though, and why certain card choices enable that, for example, me playing the Witness the Future to cycle cards back into my deck, that directly changes how I'm able to behave with Predict. In that, when I need to predict, because I have to be able to convert predicts early in order to be able to get enough cards to both exchange and make land drops. And if I can't convert those because I don't want to mill the top card of my deck, whatever it may be, that would be a problem. There would be a tension there that I otherwise could alleviate. So by playing the Witness the Future, if I see a land on top of my deck that I need, like let's say I know my Prismatic Endings are going to have to go to 3 colors at some point in this game. If I'm playing my one of Splash, my in this case I would be playing a Volk, but like if I see my Volk on top and I have to mill it in order to get through wherever I am in the current position of the game, and then I lost access to that Volk for the rest of the game, that would be a problem.
Yeah.
Because I have witnessed the future, knowing that I will have it forever means that like I can know this because I will have the resources to perpetuate the game still.
Yeah.
And if I were to lose that resource, I wouldn't be able to perpetuate the game. And so like in that regard, like just sort of stealing that theory, not necessarily because it's changing a card choice, but it's changing how I get to behave with the choices of cards that I've made, that like can really, really help when you're sitting down at a table and play in a way that is optimized and proficient. You don't have to be like, oh shit, I punted. It's like, no. We know that like I can make all of these decisions. I'm not going to walk on a rake because all of this theory is like tested and proven and reliable. So like, there you go, man. Miracles, the infinite
Miracles.
game.
Yeah. The infinite game. All right. Well, thank you all for watching, and we will catch you on the flip. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button. It grows the legacy content ecosystem we all love by relaying to the platform that you are part of our passionate community.
And to go even further, click the links for subscription or to support directly via Patreon to help us create more content for you. Patreon supporters get 4 exclusive extra episodes per month. If you're listening on an audio platform, head over to patreon.com/eternaldurdles.
Thanks so much for your support.
We'll see you in the next one.